Okay, good morning. Good morning, and thank you all for coming this morning. My name is Kelly Palmer, and I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Degreed. And it is my pleasure today to welcome Karie Willyerd, who is the Chief Learning Officer at Visa. So Karie and I today are going to talk a little bit about learning in the expertise economy. And Karie, for those of you who don't know her, Karie and I go way back. And actually, Karie gave me my first opportunity in the learning field. And Karie has been at some amazing companies, Sun Microsystems, as well as SuccessFactors, SAP, and now Visa. She's also the author of 2 books, one, The 2020 Workplace, and the second is Stretch, How to Future-Proof Your Career. And so today what we're going to do is have a fireside chat. I'm going to ask Karie some questions about the future of work and the future of learning, and then we're going to open it up for all of you to ask your questions to either of us. So Karie, go ahead.
You didn't promote your latest book, The Expertise Economy, which is fresh off the press, less than a year, right?
That's right. That's my first book as well, and it is The Expertise Economy, How the Smartest Companies Use Learning to Engage, Compete, and Succeed. And we are selling it here at the bookstore today, and we're going to be having a book signing after this session. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can join us at the book signing. So thanks, Karie.
Cool.
So let's start our conversation with Karie, you telling us a little bit about your career journey. You've had an amazing career, and I'm sure that you've had some themes that have been working through a lot of what you've done in your work over the years. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your career journey and what some of those themes are.
Well, a little known fact, I started off as a journalist. So I was a newspaper reporter. And I went to a session here where there were 5 panelists who were all recovering journalists. So I thought that was kind of funny that there were folks here. And then went to work in for a company that taught journalists how to write training materials. So my first role was in nuclear power, doing nuclear power training, wearing a hard hat on a construction site, and then kind of eventually working into designing scenarios for the control room, for the simulator in the control room. And then I went to control room, simulators in airplanes, and went to work for a company that did flight simulation training. And then went to Lockheed Martin. So then that's where I kind of like grew up, was inside Lockheed Martin, until I was head of learning there, then head of exec ed for Heinz. And then chief talent officer, chief learning officer, as you've kind of laid out. So, so they were all kind of like natural progressions. But for somebody who ended up more in executive development, it's funny that I started off in like the very technical components of it.
Right.
And I'm one of those folks who I'm a first generation college student in my family, and so I got my degree in my late 20s. Had to work it in with life, and then I got a master's. I just kind of like kept on going, until I ran out of degrees to acquire. So finally getting a doctorate, but it took me a long time.
I should have introduced you as Dr. Karie Willyerd. Pardon me, because I know you do have your doctorate.
Well, we ended up going to the same master's program.
Well, that's an interesting story too, because when I got my first opportunity to get into learning, I actually moved from product development then into corporate strategy and realized I really wanted to move into the learning field. And Karie gave me my first opportunity to do that. Once I got the job, I actually thought, well, I'll go. I went through the program that Karie went for her master's in education, technology, and adult learning. And it was a fabulous experience being able to actually learn about learning while I was actually doing a corporate job, being able to apply what I was learning on the job. So that was really great. So I think that was a good program. I would highly recommend it.
Yeah, out of Boise State. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So what led you to focus on adult learning? And, you know, specifically, I know that a lot of the work that you've been doing over the years has focused, and we did a lot of this at Sun, focused on how technology can help us learn better. So what made you, you know, want to focus on adult learning, and especially focus on how technology can help us learn that way?
Yeah, I suppose the thing that I'm a naturally curious person, so I suppose I really liked being in the learning function, because you were constantly learning new things about the business or about skills or capabilities. I remember like a very fun one was meeting with the guy who, if you ever saw Silence of the Lambs, you know, the guy that was Jodie Foster's boss.
Yes.
That headed up the behavioral science unit.
Right.
Well, after he retired from the FBI, he went out and started doing training on how do you recognize danger at work, or people who are volatile and may explode and that kind of thing. And so, you know, getting to go to dinner and talk with that kind of a person is just a really intriguing and interesting kind of thing to do. So when I did stints as, you know, they were rotating me through to be in HR, I realized I don't really like the other HR parts. I really like this space, and so I decided to go deep in this space. And then I've worked for large companies. So Visa at 17,000 employees is one of the smallest companies I've ever worked for. And so you need technology to scale learning. So when you need to reach people that are in, I guess we do business in all but the 4 countries that we can't because of bans on commerce with them. So we're in every country in the world except those 4. And you can't just put a trainer on a plane and go around the world. You won't reach them all. So you have to think about how do you scale when you're in a really large business.
So the other thing I think is really interesting about your role as the Chief Learning Officer at Visa is that it's not in HR. It's actually the strategy organization. So can you talk a little bit about that and why maybe that, you know, they have learning in the strategy organization rather than in HR? I mean, when we were at Sun, learning was not in HR either. It was in global sales and service. We had a revenue generating component, huge revenue generating component of our business, where we actually got to reinvest the money we made back into innovative technology. And now I see this, you know, the trend of that. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
So this was, we have a relatively new CEO. He came out of American Express, and then he was on our board, and then came in as the CEO almost 3 years ago now. And he just has a real passion about people. And so he looked at the changes he wanted to make when we came in. Well, little known fact, I should back up. 10 years ago, Visa was a nonprofit company, or corporation, I should say, entity. And so it's only in the last 10 years that we spun off from being a nonprofit into combining all the Visa entities around the world, and we're now publicly held. So there's some ways in which it's kind of a young company. And so he looked at what we needed to do and saw there's lots of work to do in HR, and there's lots of work to do because of, you know, his values around the importance of people in a business. So he decided to pull out learning and put it into the way my boss says that my boss is head of strategy and is employee number 2 at Visa at the 10-year mark. And he said, and he gets the corner office, the CEO gets the one next to him. And he says, well, Al called and said, I've got learning is how that happened.
That's fun.
So, and it's in order to make it a more strategic play, and not only with employees, but in the industry. So I've got responsibility for external training, for training governments, for social impact, for helping developing economies move to a card-based or a cashless society. So training the woman with a goat in Africa how she can use banking and so on, as opposed to putting it in a little locker in her hut.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating how I really don't think that there's been a more exciting time to be in the learning field as right now. And I know at Degreed, we're working with some really forward-thinking clients. For example, Unilever is, Tim Munden, their CLO there, is actually working on a strategy with their CEO and their CHRO, around upskilling and reskilling their 160,000 employees across the globe. And so I think with this nervousness about CEOs not thinking that their employees necessarily have the skills that they need to be successful moving forward, the learning is being elevated to more of a strategic position. And so you're one example of that, I think. Tim Munden and Unilever is another example of that.
Right now in the U.S., there is a task force of CEOs in the chamber, Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, and some of the university heads, and SHRM is a member, looking at how do we ensure people are employable for the future with so much change in technology and so on.
Right.
I was just talking to someone where I was reading a little note my CEO sent me this week about a conversation he had at Davos, where a group of CEOs were saying, we don't feel like we have to offer lifetime employment, but we should offer lifetime employability.
Right.
And so are we doing enough to ensure that if somebody's not ready for us still, could they be ready for another job because we've prepared them for that? And so it seems like that's it was this theme in this government task force that's been pulled together. It was a theme at Davos.
And it's been a theme here at ASU GSV as well, I believe. So speaking of that, so what do you think the most important skills will be for the future? And how can companies kind of predict what's going to be needed? It's a big question. I get that a lot also. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So in my last book, Barbara, my co-author, she's a president of a college.
And your last book, Stretch?
Yes, okay. Stretch, And so we hired an intern to just kind of go look at all the studies on what are people predicting about skills, and then just tried to do a meta-analysis of those. And we came to the conclusion, we listed a lot of the ones that people are typically doing. I think Microsoft has done a tremendous amount of work in this space that I think is really good, along with other places that we looked at. And we thought there's probably two key things to look at. There's lots of other stuff to look at, but just one is be really good and up to date in the field that you're in. So we're in learning, so just make sure we sit on the cutting edge of the learning space and not be a trainer in a classroom day in, day out, and not branch out from there, but get really good in your space and stay ahead technologically in your space. And then the second one was emotional intelligence, because that's one that we just hear so much from, in terms of, people come in, but then they may be great, but they can't convey their greatness to others,
right,
or bring a customer along, or build collaborative ties to get a project together.
Right.
So we said, there's probably a dozen or so key capabilities for the future, but if you had to pick just two to focus on, those would be the two. What do you think?
Yeah, we wrote about this a bit in our book, The Expertise Economy, and we looked at it as, as AI, as automation, digitization, and acceleration become key things that are disrupting the workforce. We were thinking that there's two skills, like you said, the two sets of skills, the technology skills that clearly, like a lot of companies, are focusing on digital literacy, and they need to know more about machine learning and data analytics. And so those are some of the hard skills. But we call the other skills, which are traditionally known as soft skills, power skills. And those are the ones that you're, like the emotional intelligence, communication, empathy, curiosity. Those are the skills that are uniquely human, and that will be harder for machines to take over. And so I think there have been some studies done that say that those people that have those types of skills will be most successful in the workplace moving forward, because you can train for hard skills, but the soft skills are what really create most of the value.
Yeah.
So
another theme that I've been seeing, like if you read in Harvard Business Review or in the Sunday paper where there's a business section, that CEOs seem to be talking a lot about now, it is curiosity.
Yeah.
And I hadn't made the connection that it's hard for a machine to be curious. Yeah.
Right.
And so, so interesting that that's also a theme that seems to be very prominent now.
Right. And I also talk a lot about learning agility, this idea that, you know, if there's one skill that employees should have, it's learning agility, which is defined as the curiosity and the motivation to continuously learn and build new skills. And that if you're wondering if you're a hiring manager and if you wonder whether somebody has learning agility, ask them, what did you learn last week? What did you learn last month or last year? And you'll get a sense of whether people are continuously learning. And I think more and more companies now are realizing they need to empower their employees to be curious and to be learning without actually telling them what they need to learn or what they need to do. I think it's a challenge, though. Mm-hmm. I do think it's a challenge. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so so our companies, so this huge effort for a lot of companies, and probably what's on most CEOs' minds today is how do I upskill and reskill the workforce? And there's statistics that show that most companies think that they're going to have to upskill or reskill up to a quarter of their workforce over the next few years. So, Karie, what do you think? I mean, are companies having success with upskilling and reskilling, and what are some of the challenges in doing that?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, obviously the challenge is the same one that everyone in this room faces, which is you're so busy working right now in the things that you've got to do right now that it's hard to think about what am I going to do next week, or what's 6 months from now look like, or what does 3 years look like, and how do I need to be ready for that? So I think that the immediate is the thing that gets in the way of kind of thinking about reskilling. I think a company that did this really well was AT&T. And so I had a chance to work with them a bit, and they recognized that the CEO there, his brother was a lineman, and is the one who got him into the company. So they come from a company of like this traditional people climbing poles literally and doing the lines, to becoming a company that distributes, you know, content and is a digital company. As you know, they bought DirecTV, for example, and they're you know in the midst of other acquisitions that have been very public. So the CEO there said he could see this kind of coming, where they were coming. So he worked with their corporate university, and then Coursera, and a university, and laid out first off a set of kind of mandatory modules that people had to go through that were, here's where we're going as a company, and here are the skills that we think are going to be important in the future. And he laid out a very public statement: a third of the people that work here, their skills are not going to be relevant here in 10 years. And he had to go through this training to understand why and what that meant and so on. And then the Coursera, and I think it was like at Georgia Tech or something like that, they created a master's program that you could go, you know, take in a distance learning way to be reskilled for the future. And they offered other programs as well, but that was more of like a software engineering kind of program. So I think what it really takes is this long view, where you're looking out 10 years. Because I think I was working with them 8 years ago, and they're still in the process on it. So. Right. And the long view is kind of hard for companies to do.
Right.
Yeah.
I think and speaking of the CEO of AT&T, I think he made a pretty bold statement that not a lot of CEOs may be willing to make to his employees, saying, look, if you're not learning at least 5 to 10 hours a week on your own, building your skills, your skills will become obsolete and you might not have a job. So kind of a brutal statement that was in the New York Times. And then But then he followed on with all the things
with
you
all
just,
these offerings of what they
right,
have.
which is great. But I think that would be better if more CEOs and companies would actually say that to their employees. Like, look, this is so important, not just for the success of our company, but for the success of you and your career, and to make sure that people always stay relevant.
Right, as opposed to the first time you get a picture of it as a pink slip.
Right.
You know, with 60 days notice or
Right,
whatever. Yeah.
exactly. So I want to turn a bit to your book, Stretch, and the part of what I loved, some sections in your book there where you talk about living longer, and so a lot of you may know that the 100-Year Life, Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott write about living longer, and so we're needing to rethink the stages of our life. And in your book, you talk about how you interviewed a lot of people in your book that were living longer and were still working and still had purpose. I'd love for you to talk a bit more about, what you found in your research there, and also what companies can do, to help, because I feel like it's not really a demographic that companies are focusing on much. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting. I mean, so for our book, I personally interviewed 6 people who were over 100 and working, and the oldest was 106, and still working in a technology company in the Silicon Valley. And so I asked her, well, she was in kind of a facilities receptions type role. And, when I talked to her, it was really about her friends were at work. And she said, honey, all my friends are dead. So her friends were like, her social system was at work. And then I said, so what's next for you then? And she said, well, I thought she was going to say, I am going to retire or whatever. And no, she said, there's a new software system that the facilities group is using on scheduling, and I'd really like to get to learn that. So I thought she was a really interesting example of somebody who used the word learning about, continuing to learn at 106 years old. So I think that's I think the vibrancy of the group of people I interviewed there made me get a little bit more interested in it. And this is a phenomena it does hit women more than it does men, for a couple of reasons. Women live longer on average. Sorry, guys. And secondly, women of my generation or a generation older maybe took a little more time out of the workplace in their 20s, and so they're hitting their prime later in life. Witness many of the politicians like a Nancy Pelosi, for example, raised 5 children and then went into politics and is now 79, I believe. So I think some of our, I don't know. I decided when I was leaving SAP that I still wanted to do one more thing, and I wasn't quite clear what it was going to be. And I thought, well, I wonder if I can get hired at this age. And honestly, I was just kind of like turning down offer after offer after offer, even interviews. So I feel like there's a little more openness to it now, whereas people used to say, oh, after 55 you can't get a job, and I'm a lot older than 55, so I think it's interesting that. I think if you've got the right skills and you've got a reputation and a brand, you can work as long as you want to, and at least I am. Right.
No, I think that's great. Very optimistic. And I know I interviewed Nigel Payne, who's an industry learning thought leader in the UK, for the book as well, and he talked about kind of where I think companies may be missing the boat a little bit, in that we tend to focus so much on millennials and new college grads coming into the workforce, and then a little bit on, I think traditionally it's been leaders and managers and high potential employees. I think there's this movement now to also focus on the general employee population and the other 80% of people who aren't managers and leaders and high potential employees. But his point was, we also are missing it if we're not also focusing on, instead of just assuming that somebody that's in their 50s or 60s are getting ready to retire, that maybe they're thinking about what's my next career move, because they might have 30 more years, in that they want to work. Not maybe some people financially have to work, and other people really want to keep working. So how can we, focus on that demographic a little bit more in the workforce? And it sounds like also it's taking ownership over your own career, which you talk a lot about in Stretch as well.
And we did a research study at SAP where we surveyed people in 26 different countries and so on with Oxford Economics. And one of the things we found that was interesting is that one of the main dissatisfiers for people over 50 was their lack of development, that they'd been kind of given up on for lack of development, and it would be the number one reason they would leave to go to another company would be because of not getting developed. And so, and development may look different for them. It might not be getting a rotational program that's going to take you to lots of different departments, but I think everybody wants to know that they're continuing to learn and grow. Yeah,
absolutely. So, so if we switch to other trends that are happening in the workforce, so we talked a bit about, artificial intelligence, machine learning, personalized experiences. What do you see as some of the most important trends in learning?
I'm still very uber focused on the learner and the learner experience. And I think all of those other things are tools to enable a learner experience. So, so machine learning and artificial intelligence serve at the need of this learner experience. And I think it's, I was just talking to someone right before I came down here about how many learning functions, when they're organizing things, they think about, well, you need to learn everything there is to know about data science, and you need to know everything there is about this topic and this topic and this topic, all our products and so on. And I hate learning that's organized like that, because it's about our stuff or content. And I think what people really care about is, who am I and what do I need to know out of each of those content areas? Yeah. And so really fixating on how can we get better and better and better at knowing the learner and bringing content to them, because there's so much stuff out there. Right. It's really more a matter of curating and getting to them, and less and less that we have to go build these flagship programs. Right. We still have to do some of those, but less of that and more of a focus on the learner.
Well, I think that some of your thinking, it's very consistent, but you were, even at Sun Microsystems, 10 years ago, you were talking about, the learner experience and what people need when they need it, more personalization. I think technology is finally catching up to some of the things that we've always wanted to do.
Right. And we had a project, Virgil.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, because Virgil was the guide through hell, so,
right.
Content was all hell.
And speaking of that, that was kind of like, how do, if we think about skills as being really important for what people need to be doing moving forward, thinking about where their careers are, where they want to go next, what skills they might need to do that. A lot of companies more traditionally have thought about competency models and skills taxonomies, but they've always been kind of static, not so dynamic. I think technology now is enabling us to do things more dynamically. That's one of the things I'm really excited about, is that as skills change, as requirements change, that it can be more dynamic.
Yeah, and I think, just the simplest of things, like recommendations. People who like this, like this.
Right.
That's just, I think we still want room for, like, serendipity in our life.
Right.
Sometimes it's serendipity in shopping, but, serendipity in learning is also.
Absolutely. So how do you think, so you wrote a book, your first book was the 2020 Workplace, where you had some predictions I think back, what year was that?
2010.
2010, and you had some predictions what would happen in 2020 with the workplace. I think you were pretty on with some of those predictions, and I'm curious now, as you think ahead to the next 10 years, what are some of your predictions for the world of work and the world of learning?
Yeah. Well, I do think this gig economy is going to penetrate more into the mainstream work. So where we'll have more opportunity to bid on projects. I think IBM has done, some of the big consulting firms have got a lot more of this kind of work where you're able to float between projects and kind of advance your career by selecting the opportunities that you're working on. I see companies having fewer and fewer permanent staff and more tapping into that gig economy through third parties or contractors. And giving people more opportunity to move around. I do think that machine learning and artificial intelligence are going to change jobs dramatically at particularly job families that, like call centers and things like that. I mean, there's some phenomenal technology in that space now that it's going to be really interesting to look at. What do you think?
I think, it's interesting. PwC put out a report on the future of work. And they highlighted 4 scenarios that I thought one was about the gig worker, the gig economy, and one was still, more of what we know as traditional corporations, but maybe without HR and without but more focused on dynamic team formation and things like that. Mm-hmm. I think it's fascinating. I don't think we can really predict, but we can see how the trends are moving. And I think that the gig economy and people being able to continuously try new, as you said, new opportunities at their company if we focus on skills and people know, I now have data science skills, but that's as relevant in marketing as it is in learning or finance. I have other opportunities to move around either at my company or at another company. I think that's definitely a trend.
Yeah. I think something is going to happen out of this whole talk that's going on now about reskilling and so on at a policy level. So I worked for an outsourcing company 20 years ago. And even then the CEO said, the US just makes it too easy to lay off people compared to like what happens in the European Union, right, for example, and elsewhere in the world. So I think there will be some combination, and that's by law. So I think there's going to be some combination of forcing companies to invest in retraining, if they put people on the street, or giving more time, or I just think there's some social momentum around that space that we've gone maybe too far in discarding people into the street, and something will come of that.
Agreed. So we have about 5 minutes left in our session, and I'd love to open it up to see if any of you have any questions for Karie. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for the discussion. I'm really curious at Visa right now, any initiatives that you're exploring to create a more inclusive workforce by using this kind of a skill-based hiring approach versus degree or experience as a proxy for those roles?
We're not doing it right now, but we're having lots of conversations around this space, which I think is, and how do we make ourselves more accessible? Visa isn't really the company you think it is. You probably think we issue credit cards. We don't. We are a network. So banks issue credit cards, and banks are our customers. So we're just the technology network everybody runs on. So we have fewer employees than you would think. 17,000 for being as the 12th most valued company on the planet. So, and 40% of those are engineers. So the entry-level skill set that we have is call centers. And we don't even have a lot of call center employees because it's usually the banks that have the call center. So it's really interesting when your jobs are, with a smaller workforce like this, our jobs are product management, engineering, and sales. That's probably 70% of our workforce. So it's a little harder to figure out. And I think this is a problem for a lot of companies, because then they rely on partners to build for the kind of maybe the entry level. And so then you're really hiring people who are pretty experienced. So even for prime college graduates, those are going into jobs like HR, and that's about it. So kind of interesting, I think.
What are you exploring?
So what we're exploring is the ecosystem that we operate in. So how do we go beyond just thinking about our employees? So one of the reasons I came to Visa was just this, I have responsibility for training our employees, our customers, governments, in terms of thinking about how do we move to a cashless society, the fintechs of the world, make them amenable to Visa as a technology. So if you look at that ecosystem, that is millions of people. And so what we've been exploring is what can we do to upskill in the millions towards jobs that we know exist.
Other questions? Yeah. Yes.
Thanks for this chat. I had a question about, I love how you guys were touching on things about like, how do we not give up on our older populations, how do we make sure that we stand up as well. I'm wondering if you guys can speak a little bit about how you think about how your investment in K-12 education as well, so it requires less reskilling and more building those power skills that you talked about.
That's a great question.
So K through 12 investment?
So, in K through 12, I feel like we haven't made a strong enough bridge even in the, between industry and higher education. And so that's been more of, we write a bit about that in the book, The Expertise Economy too, how we need to have a better bridge between, what colleges are teaching students around power skills, for example, and how they're bringing, how students are prepared for the real world of work. And there's not very many universities that are focusing on that. If we go to K through 12, I think that there's, especially at this conference, a lot of people focusing on K through 12 and what we should be doing differently to prepare them for lifelong learning. And I think it would be a great idea. I personally haven't focused so much on that.
So I would say it's more through our social impact programs that we look at that. I personally am on the board of City Year San Jose, which is an AmeriCorps, so if you're familiar with it, where young adults give a year of their life to assisting in the classrooms. And in the case of here, it's in middle school. Little known fact, when you look at the Bay Area, you think of it as being a very wealthy area, but there are pockets of it that the dropout rate is incredible and significant. So San Jose, the city of San Jose, starts planning their jail cell requirements by looking at 8th grade dropout rates. So because there's a direct correlation between future jail cells needed and what's happening in the 8th grade. And if that is not scary, so we support City Year. So I think we look more through our social impact programs to look at how can we affect in the communities that we live in, because that's a community, we're based in the Bay Area, so it's a community we live in.
I think we have time for maybe one more. And
I think there was someone over here no? Okay, maybe not.
Yeah.
I just want to follow up on that question. So when you take the power skill that you're referring to, how have you reskilled in your current workforce in the power skills?
Do you want to take that or?
Will you go first and I'll go second?
So with identifying those skills as being incredibly important is a good start, you know, in terms of, I know when I was at LinkedIn, many of those power skills were things that we talked about through our culture and values, and then we created a few programs that would allow people to say, how can I be more curious? How can I have more open, honest communication? How can I communicate better? Those are some of those power skills, and it's great to talk about them, but how do you really put those into practice? And so we actually experimented with using new technology platforms to actually put cohorts of people through, so they were doing more peer-to-peer learning across the globe, and then synthesizing the information about that, but actually practicing on the job. So for example, if you're trying to have a difficult conversation at work, go and practice with a peer, and then actually have that conversation in a real work situation where you're having that problem, then come back and reflect with your peer group. Most of the power skills that traditionally are called soft skills can be taught that way. And so I think, one, identifying what those skills are and how important they are, and then you can put programs in place to do that. And I have to put out this quote. I think one of the most brilliant quotes I've heard recently is from Satya Nadella from Microsoft, who worked a lot with Carol Dweck on the growth mindset. And what he told all of his employees is that we want you all to be learn-it-alls, not know-it-alls. And he models it from the top down, right? As a CEO, he's saying, I don't know everything I need to know. I need to learn. And that makes him vulnerable, and makes his executives also believe that they don't need to act like they know everything either, because we don't. We don't all know that. So I think when we think about the power skills and the power of curiosity and learning agility and growth mindset, all of those things come into play, and your culture at your company actually plays a huge part in that, and having your executives talk about how incredibly important that is can be really powerful.
So I've been a fan for a long time of Crucial Conversations.
Oh, right.
And as you know, because as a CLO, I have a requirement that of myself and for everybody that's on my staff, you have to teach. So you have to have empathy and actually be in the classroom, because we do have classrooms still. So, yes. And so most of the folks would pick that one. I heard just the other day that Google requires Crucial Conversations of every engineer in the company.
That's awesome.
Which is interesting. So they definitely are doing something about. I love the phrase power skills. I am so taking that on.
Good. We're going to start a movement. Quit calling them soft skills, they're power skills.
Power
right.
skills, yes.
Yeah. Great.
All right.
Well, I think that we're out of time, but I really want to thank you all for coming today. I hope we enlightened you a bit about what's going on in the future of work and the future of learning. And please help me thank Karie for coming here today to have this amazing conversation. Thank you.